Audio review of textbook for Class 12. Fundamentals of Human Geography. Chapter 1. Human Geography. Nature and Scope.
Okay, so ready to dive in. Today, we are looking at human geography,
Sounds good.
which is, all about the relationship between people and the surface of the Earth.
Yeah.
We've got some really interesting material here that breaks it all down.
All right.
And what we really want is for you listening to walk away with a really solid grasp of what human geography is all about,
Right.
like the main concepts.
Okay.
So you can kind of be in the loop.
For sure.
Now think about like where you are right now.
Mm.
You've got the natural environment, like what's under your feet, the weather.
Right.
But then you've also got all the stuff humans have built, right? Buildings and roads
That's-
and how we've organized ourselves.
Yeah.
And that's really at the heart of it.
Yeah. Human geography is basically about understanding the Earth as the place where we all live
Right.
and how these natural and human elements are connected and how they affect each other.
Exactly. And that connection that is like the main thing.
Yeah.
It used to be that geographers would argue about how to approach this whole thing.
Right. Right.
But the amazing thing is that we now understand that people and nature, they aren't actually separate.
Yeah.
They're totally linked.
Absolutely.
And it's even in how we talk about the planet, like we say the face of the Earth or like the veins of a river system.
Mm-hmm.
So we use parts of the human body to describe nature,
Yeah. That's a good point.
which makes you think, can you really separate them when our language mixes them up like that?
I know, right?
And if you look at some of the big names in human geography, you see this idea of connection everywhere.
Yeah. Like,
So Ratzel, he saw it as a synthetic study, like bringing the human and the physical together.
okay.
Then you've got Semple, and she was all about the changing relationship between humans and their surroundings.
Interesting.
And Vidal de la Blache, he really stressed the interrelationships and this new way of seeing that connection.
So they were all about how interconnected we are.
Exactly.
So basically, human geography looks at how the physical world, like land, climate, plants, and animals, interacts with the stuff that people create, like societies and cultures and technologies.
Like I said, we build houses out of resources from the earth.
Right.
We create these huge cities,
Yes.
and we develop ways to travel around.
Transportation.
Right, transportation.
Yeah.
But we're not just using the environment.
Yeah.
We're actually changing it.
Right.
And it's changing how we live.
Absolutely.
You know, back in the day when we didn't have so much technology,
Yeah.
our lives were super influenced by nature.
Right.
That's what some call like naturalization of humans or environmental determinism.
Okay.
Back then, people were way more dependent on natural forces.
I can imagine.
And often, they were in awe of them.
Yeah.
Like there's this tribe in central India called the Benda.
Okay.
And their entire way of life, how they farmed, what they ate, even their spiritual beliefs, all tied to the forest.
Wow.
They were completely connected to what they called Mother Nature.
That's amazing.
But as societies developed, especially with all the new technologies, humans got better at shaping their environment. It's called humanization of nature or possibilism.
Okay.
So instead of just seeing the environment as a limit,
Right.
we start seeing it as a bunch of possibilities.
Makes sense.
Like think about Kari in Frondheim. Her life is totally modern with heating and imported food, and she's connected to the world.
Wow.
And it shows how technology allows people to get past a lot of the limitations of nature.
Yeah.
And then the landscape changes because of what humans do.
So we're kind of leaving our mark everywhere.
Yeah, and then there's this more balanced perspective called neo-determinism, which was this guy Griffith Taylor's idea.
What's that?
It's basically that we have choices,
Okay.
but we still have to understand and work within nature's boundaries.
I see.
It's like a traffic light,
Right?
right? We can only go when it's green,
Right.
otherwise there will be problems.
Yeah.
So we have these possibilities, but if we go too far, it can cause things like climate change.
It's all about balance. Not just going all out.
Yeah, not just one way or the other.
And you know how human geographers have looked at these things has changed a lot over time.
Uh-huh.
First, it was exploring and describing.
Right.
Then it was about understanding specific regions.
Yeah.
Later, it was about spatial patterns and using data.
Okay.
And now it's more about humanistic and social and even postmodern views.
So looking at things from lots of different angles.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And it's pretty cool how connected human geography is to other areas of study.
Oh, yeah?
Like it overlaps with sociology, economics, political science, so many.
That's good.
There are all these subfields like urban geography,
Right.
population geography, geography of resources.
Yeah,
It really shows how everything's connected.
it does.
So the main takeaway here is that there's this constant back and forth between humans and their environment.
Yeah.
We started out really dependent on nature,
Right.
and now we've reached a point where we shape it a lot with technology.
But at the same time, we are learning that we have to be responsible for the environment.
It's definitely a balancing act.
It is. So I'm curious, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges and opportunities we face in the 21st century when it comes to how humans and the environment interact?
Good question.
And do you think these different ideas in human geography can help us figure out those challenges and take advantage of the opportunities?
That's something to think about.
It is something to think about.
Chapter 2. The World Population. Distribution, Density, and Growth.
All right, so welcome to another deep dive. And today we're tackling something pretty fundamental, really. We're looking at the global population, like how it's spread across the planet, where the clusters are, and what drives all that, why are some places so packed and others, well, not so much. And how does it all change over time? You know, the whole birth, death, migration thing.
Yeah, and right off the bat, you see this, it's striking, this imbalance. Like, we've got 90% of humanity squeezed onto just 10% of the land.
Wow.
There's this quote from George B. Cressy. He was talking about Asia specifically, but it kind of sums it up globally, too. He said, Asia has many places where people are few, and few places where people are very many.
That is pretty spot on, isn't it? So, like, understanding how many people live in a given area, that's population density, right? The number of people per square kilometer.
Right.
And the materials we were looking at, they make it clear that this density thing, it's kind of crucial to get a feel for any region, any country, really. Like, the people, they're the heart of it, right? They shape the resources, the policies, everything.
Yeah.
It's like, take this, let's say, Region X. They've got 150,000 people crammed into 100 square kilometers. So their density is 1,500 people per square kilometer. Boom. That tells you right away this is a seriously concentrated place.
You got it. So then the question becomes, what forces are shaping these patterns, these concentrations?
Yeah, what makes people cluster in certain spots?
Well, geography is a huge one. And you got to start with water, right? I mean, that's the foundation of life, right? We need it to drink, to grow food, for industry, even transport.
Yeah, totally.
And that's why, like, historically and even now, you see these dense populations along river valleys. It's like a basic need. You know, we gravitate toward water.
Makes sense. Then you've got landforms, right?
Yeah.
So flat plains, gentle slopes, those are generally the preferred spots for, well, everything. Farming, building roads, setting up industries.
Right, it's easier.
It's way easier than trying to do all that on, like, the side of a mountain, like in the Himalayas, which, no surprise, are pretty sparsely populated.
Yeah, not exactly prime real estate.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, you've got climate. A pleasant climate, that's always a draw, right?
Right.
People want to be comfortable.
Yeah, who wants to live in extremes?
Exactly. So whether it's scorching heat, freezing cold, or, torrential rain all the time, those places tend to have fewer people.
Right, like those early settlements around the Mediterranean. Pleasant weather, boom, people move in.
Perfect example. And we can't forget about soil either. Fertile soil, that means you can grow a lot of food, sustain a bigger population.
Makes sense. So think about some of those less fertile areas in India. They tend to have lower population density. Right?
Exactly. It all ties together.
Okay, so we've got the geography part. What about the economic side of things?
Right. Well, minerals, for one. When you find a rich deposit of something valuable, that can completely change the population landscape.
Oh, yeah, like you strike oil, suddenly you've got a boom town.
Or like the copper belt in Katanga, Zambia. Huge copper reserves, so you get all these industries popping up, people flocking there for jobs. Population density goes way up.
So those mineral discoveries, they're like magnets for people.
And then you've got urbanization. Cities, they're like these huge centers of opportunity, right? Jobs, education, healthcare, everything's concentrated there.
Way more than you'd find in rural areas.
Right, so people are drawn in from the countryside. And this whole rural to urban migration, it's a major factor in how cities grow and expand. Though, I mean, the materials we looked at, they do mention that all this concentration, it can put a strain on things too, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like resources, infrastructure, you name it.
Right, cities have their challenges. And then, similar to that, you've got industrialization. So when you get these industrial centers developing, they create a whole bunch of jobs. not just in the factories themselves, but in all the supporting services around them.
Yeah, like shopkeepers, restaurants, all that.
Exactly. So you get a kind of ripple effect, drawing in more and more people, like the Kobe Osaka region in Japan. That's a good example. Super industrialized, super dense population.
Okay, so we've got geography, we've got economics. What else is there?
Well, we can't leave out social and cultural factors.
Yep.
So sometimes a place will be significant for religious reasons, or maybe it has some cultural importance, and that can draw people in.
Right, like a pilgrimage site or a historic landmark.
Exactly. But then on the flip side, you might have social unrest or political turmoil in a region, and that can push people to leave, right?
So,
And sometimes governments will step in and offer incentives to try and influence where people live. Like they might encourage people to move to less populated areas, or maybe they'll offer help to people trying to get out of overcrowded cities.
interesting. So it's not just about the land itself, it's about all these human factors too.
Absolutely.
All right, so we've talked about how populations are distributed, but they're not static, right? They change over time. That's what we call population growth, isn't it?
Right, right. It's basically how the number of people in a place goes up or down over a certain period. And it's a pretty important indicator of how a region's doing overall, in terms of development and all that.
Yeah, makes sense. So what are the key things to keep in mind with population growth?
Well, first you have the growth itself, which is just the simple difference in numbers between 2 points in time. And then you have the growth rate, which expresses that change as a percentage. And then there's natural growth, which is just births minus deaths. But then the actual growth, that takes into account migration too. So it's births minus deaths plus people coming in, that's immigration, minus people leaving, that's immigration.
Okay, that makes sense.
So if there are more births and people coming in than deaths and people leaving, you have positive growth. If it's the other way around, it's negative growth.
Makes sense. So births, deaths, and migration, those are the big three when it comes to population change.
You got it. And we also talk about birth rates and death rates, right? So the crude birth rate, that's CBR, it's the number of live births per 1,000 people.
Okay.
And then the crude death rate, or CDR, that's deaths per 1,000 people. And one thing that's interesting is that those death rates, they're really tied to how developed a society is. Things like healthcare, sanitation, general living conditions, they all play a role.
Yeah, makes sense. The more advanced a society is, the lower the death rate tends to be.
Generally, yeah. And then there's migration, which is, it's simply people moving from one place to another.
Right, and that movement, it obviously affects the population size in both the place they're leaving and the place they're going to.
Exactly. So the place of origin loses people, the destination gains people. And it can be, a permanent move, or it could be temporary, maybe for work or school, or even seasonal, like for farm labor.
Interesting.
And you can have migration between rural areas, between cities, from rural to urban, or even urban to rural. And it's kind of funny when you think about it. Every migrant is both an immigrant and an immigrant at the same time.
Right, yeah, two sides of the same coin.
Exactly. And there are all sorts of reasons why people migrate. We often talk about push and pull factors. So push factors are the things that make people want to leave a place, like a lack of jobs, bad living conditions, maybe there's a war or some kind of social upheaval, or even just a bad climate or natural disasters.
Right, so those are the things pushing them out.
Exactly. And then pull factors, those are the things that draw people to a new place. Like maybe there are more job opportunities, better living conditions, more safety and security, a nicer climate, things like that.
So those are the things pulling them in. Okay, that makes sense.
Right. And this whole idea of how populations change and evolve over time, it kind of leads us to this theory called the demographic transition theory. It tries to explain how, as societies develop and go from being mostly rural and agricultural to more urban and industrial, their population patterns shift in predictable ways.
Interesting. So it's like a model for how population change happens as societies modernize.
Yeah, exactly. And they break it down into these stages. So stage one, that's kind of the starting point. You have high birth rates and high death rates. So the population grows very slowly. Most people are involved in agriculture. Life expectancy is pretty short, and technology is pretty basic.
So that's like the traditional pre-industrial society.
Right. And historically, every society was in this stage at some point.
Okay, so then what happens?
Well, then you move into stage two, where the birth rates are still high, but the death rates start to drop significantly because of things like improvements in healthcare and sanitation.
So people are living longer.
Right. And that means the population starts to increase more rapidly. Like Bangladesh and Kenya, they're often cited as being in this stage.
Okay.
And then comes stage 3. Now, both the birth rates and the death rates are low. So the population growth stabilizes, maybe even slows down a bit. These societies tend to be pretty urbanized. People are more educated. They have access to advanced technology, and families are smaller.
So, like, countries like Canada, Japan, the USA, they'd be in this stage, right?
Exactly. And what's interesting is that this theory shows how people adapt their behavior, especially when it comes to having children, in response to these changes in society. And it's important to remember that not every country is at the same stage, right? There's a lot of variation around the world.
Right. Everyone's at a different point in their development.
Exactly. And then finally, we have to talk about population control measures. So things like family planning, which is all about giving people access to contraception and education, about spacing out births. That's a major approach to managing population growth.
Yeah, because if the population grows too quickly, it can put a strain on resources.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the materials we looked at, they mentioned things like public awareness campaigns, even financial disincentives for having large families, as ways to encourage family planning. And this all kind of goes back to this idea from Thomas Malthus, who way back in the 1700s was warning that population could grow faster than our ability to produce food, which could lead to all kinds of problems like famine and war. So managing population growth sustainably, that's a really important issue.
Wow. Yeah, that's a big one. So I guess to kind of sum up, we've looked at how the global population is spread out, where it's concentrated, and what factors, both geographical and economic and social, influence those patterns. And we've looked at how populations change over time through births, deaths, and migration, and how that all fits into this idea of the demographic transition model.
Exactly. And it's a lot to think about. But maybe one thing for our listeners to consider is this. We've got all these different countries around the world, all these different stages of demographic transition. So what do you think are the biggest challenges and the biggest opportunities facing societies with really rapid population growth compared to those that are growing slowly or maybe even shrinking? How will they navigate these very different realities in the 21st century?
Yeah, that's a great question to ponder. And that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for listening, and keep thinking about those challenges and opportunities. They're pretty important for all of us.
Absolutely.
Chapter 3. Human Development.
All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling something pretty fundamental, I think. What's the real difference between growth and development, especially when we're talking about, entire countries and communities and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that a lot of people, a lot of thinkers have grappled with. We've got some really interesting material here on human development and how to actually measure it.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a question with real-world implications, like how we understand what's going on around us.
Totally.
So our mission today, I guess, is to get beyond the basics, what actually makes a society better. I mean, we often hear about, growing GDP and all that.
Right, right.
But is that really the same thing as development?
Well, and that's where things get really interesting. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. Growth isn't always the same as development.
Right. And our sources make this really clear right off the bat. Growth is all about quantities. It's like, if a city's population goes up or if it goes down, by the numbers.
Yeah, it's just like a measure of change. Like, is something getting bigger or smaller?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not saying if that change is good or bad.
Exactly.
Development, on the other hand, that's about positive change.
Yeah.
Like it has to be an improvement.
Right. It's about quality, not just quantity.
Yeah, like a city could double in size.
Yeah.
But if you don't have better roads or schools or, housing to support all those people, that's just growth without development, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's like imagine a coastal city gets hit by a tsunami and then people are moving away. That would be negative growth, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily tell us about the quality of life or, the opportunities that are there.
Right. And for decades,
Yeah.
a country's success was pretty much judged just on economic growth.
Yeah. Like how much money is it making?
Right.
But a growing economy, it doesn't automatically mean better lives for everyone.
No, it doesn't.
And I think that's where things started to shift. And there are two people who had a really big influence here. Two South Asian economists, actually, Mahbubul Haq and Amartya Sen.
Yeah, these guys were working, in the late 1980s, early 1990s.
Yeah.
And they really shook things up.
Yeah, they did. So Dr. Mahbubul Haq, he had this really powerful idea. He said development's not just about the economy. It's about people, like enlarging their choices and improving their well-being.
Okay. So it's about creating the conditions where people can actually live meaningful lives.
Exactly. Like being healthy, you know, developing their talents, being able to participate in society, having the freedom to choose what they want to do.
And I love that quote from him. You see things that are carrying and ask why. I dream of things that never were and ask why not.
Yeah, it's so inspiring.
It is. It's really about envisioning a better future, right? And Amartya Sen had a similar focus. He saw development as an increase in freedom.
Yeah, like having more options.
Right. And he argued that, when people have more freedom, that actually leads to more development down the line.
It's like a positive feedback loop.
Yeah.
And he was really big on the role of social and political systems. Like, how do institutions either help or hinder people's freedom?
Yeah, it's not just about money. It's about, like, the structures of society.
Totally. And I think one of the really important things that both of these guys did was to really shift the focus to some of the most essential aspects of human development.
Like what?
Well, like having a long and healthy life.
Yeah.
Being able to gain knowledge and learn, and then having enough resources, for a decent life.
Right, the basics.
Yeah. And when we think about those things, it's clear that, access to healthcare, education, having your basic needs met, these become absolutely central to human development.
And our sources, they kind of outline 4 key pillars of human development, right?
Yeah. And these are really crucial because they kind of underpin everything else. So the first one is equity. And this means that everyone should have the same opportunities, regardless of their gender, race, their income, or their social background.
Right. And the second pillar is sustainability, which is about making sure that future generations will have the same opportunities that we do.
Exactly. And that means thinking about the environment, of course, but also our financial resources and our human resources as well.
Right, yeah. And then we have productivity, which is about recognizing that people are the real wealth of a nation, right? And so a productive society is one where people have the skills and capabilities to contribute and to flourish.
Yeah. And all of those things are tied together with the fourth pillar, which is empowerment. It's about giving people the power to make their own choices, and that comes through having more freedom and more capability.
Right. Like if a child doesn't have a good education, then their career choices are going to be limited, right?
Absolutely.
And if someone can't afford medical treatment, then their health and their potential are going to be restricted.
Yeah, exactly. And I think these 4 pillars are all interconnected. Like if you don't have equity in education, then that's going to impact a nation's productivity down the line, right?
Right. It's all connected.
Yeah. And so, we've got these pillars of human development. We understand why it's important. But then the question is, how do we approach it? And our source looks at a few different approaches that have been taken over the years.
Yeah. There's the income approach, which basically says more money equals more freedom and therefore more human development.
Right. And then there's the welfare approach, which is more about the government providing services, like education, healthcare, Social Security, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Then there's the basic needs approach.
Right. This one really focuses on providing people with the essentials, like making sure everyone has access to food, water, sanitation, housing.
Okay, so it's about covering those absolute necessities.
Yeah.
But I guess the critique of that approach is that it could be seen as treating people as passive recipients rather than active participants in their own development, right?
Yeah, there's that potential pitfall.
Okay. And then finally, we have the capability approach, which, as we talked about, was really developed by Amartya Sen.
Yeah. And this approach is all about building people's core capabilities, giving them the tools and the resources to make their own choices and live the lives they value.
So how do we measure all of this?
Yeah.
I mean, is there a way to quantify human development?
Well, that leads us to the Human Development Index, or the HDI.
Yeah, I've heard of that. So the HDI basically gives every country a score, right? A ranking based on things like health, education, and living standards.
Exactly. So for health, they look at life expectancy at birth, how long people are expected to live on average. For education, they look at things like literacy rates and school enrollment. And then for living standards, they use a measure called purchasing power, which tells us how much people can actually buy with their money in different countries.
So it takes into account the fact that, a dollar doesn't go as far in some places as it does in others.
Exactly. And the HDI gives equal weight to each of these 3 dimensions: health, education, and living standards. And the score ranges from 0 to 1, so the closer a country is to 1, the higher its level of human development.
So it's a way to kind of get a snapshot of how well a country is doing. But you said before that it doesn't tell the whole story, right?
Yeah, it's a really useful tool, but it does have its limitations. One of the big ones is that it doesn't really show us how evenly the benefits of development are distributed within a country.
Okay. So 2 countries could have the same HDI score. But in one country, the wealth could be very concentrated at the top, while in the other country, it's more evenly spread out.
Exactly. And that's why it's also really important to look at things like the Human Poverty Index, or HPI.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. So the HPI, what does that measure?
Well, instead of looking at achievements like the HDI does, the HPI focuses on deprivations. So things like the probability of not surviving to age 40, adult illiteracy, the lack of access to clean water, and the percentage of children who are underweight.
So it's like looking at the flip side of the coin.
Exactly. And sometimes it can reveal a very different picture than the HDI alone. A country could have a relatively high HDI, but still have a significant portion of its population living in poverty.
Right. And it's interesting to look at how different countries compare, right?
Yeah.
Our source points out that a high GDP doesn't automatically mean a high HDI.
Yeah, you can have countries that are very wealthy in terms of their overall economic output, but they might not be investing enough in things like education and healthcare, which are crucial for human development.
Right. And the source gives the example of Sri Lanka, which has a higher HDI than some countries with much larger economies.
Yeah, and even within India, you see these differences, like the state of Kerala, which has a lower per capita income than some other states, but it has a higher HDI because it's invested more in social programs and things like that.
So it really highlights the fact that, it's not just about how much money a country has, it's about how that money is being used. And our source also mentions that countries with higher HDIs tend to be more politically stable.
Yeah, there's definitely a correlation there.
Right. And they tend to invest more in their social sectors.
Absolutely. And on the flip side, countries with low HDIs often have higher levels of political instability, and they might be spending more of their resources on things like defense rather than on improving people's lives.
And it's important to note that the source is very clear that it's not about culture or religion determining these outcomes.
Exactly.
Right. India, for example, ranked 132nd out of 191 countries in 2021 on the HDI. And, there are a lot of factors that contribute to that, but it's not because of some inherent cultural deficiency.
Right. It's much more complex than that.
Yeah. So, I think what we've seen today is that development is a much broader concept than just economic output.
Yeah. At the end of the day, it's really about people's capabilities, their freedom to make choices, and to live lives that they value.
Right. And that makes me think about something that I read recently about Bhutan's concept of gross national happiness, or G&H.
Oh, yeah.
Where they actually prioritize spiritual well-being, non-material aspects of life, and qualitative measures alongside material progress.
Yeah, it's a really interesting approach. It kind of turns the whole idea of progress on its head.
Yeah, and I think it raises a really interesting question for all of us. Could happiness and well-being offer a more complete measure of a nation's progress than just these standard economic indicators, or even the HDI, for that matter?
Yeah. It's definitely something worth thinking about. And for those of you who want to explore this further, I'd recommend checking out the latest Human Development Report. It's a great resource for getting a deeper understanding of these issues.
Yeah. And I think it'd be interesting to look at how factors like good governance, political freedom, and access to information might relate to HDI scores.
Yeah.
What other measures do you think could give us a more nuanced understanding of how people are actually doing?
Yeah, there's so much to think about. Thanks for diving deep with us today.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Chapter 4. Primary Activities.
All right, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into, how we as humans, how we make a living right from the earth itself. They call them primary activities, right?
Yeah.
And, we got some really interesting material to go through.
Absolutely.
Covering, everything.
Yeah.
From, ancient times, how we survived, to, global industries, huge, massive scales.
It is really a broad spectrum.
Yeah, and so the goal here is to, extract the good stuff.
Yeah. Find the nuggets.
Yeah, nuggets, the key insights and all that.
Yeah, the really essential things that folks should know.
Yeah, definitely.
About these really foundational economic activities.
Yeah.
The ones that are directly dependent on the planet.
Hmm.
So, we're talking about the land, the water, all the vegetation, even the minerals, all that.
Yeah.
So think of it like this. Stuff like hunting and gathering, herding animals, farming, all the way to mining.
Mm-hmm.
These are the absolute basics of how societies, any society really, can sustain itself.
Yeah, you're right. We got to start somewhere.
For sure.
It's got to be the very first thing we figured out.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. Hunting and gathering.
Yeah. Yeah.
Probably, I'm guessing that was it.
Pretty much, yeah. For the vast majority of human history,
Yeah.
that's how we got by,
Oh, wow.
just, relying on what you could hunt, what you could find.
Yeah.
And it's pretty amazing, right? Because even now, even today,
Right.
there are communities in some like really harsh environments, think like really difficult places to live,
Yeah.
that still depend on those skills, on those like ancient skills.
Really. That's incredible.
It is, it is. And what I find really, really interesting
Yeah.
is how gathering has evolved, you know?
How so?
So it started out as pure survival, right? You gather what you can to live.
Right.
But now we see this whole market-oriented gathering thing happening,
Okay.
where people are out there collecting specific plants, valuable plants, not just anything, but things that they know they can sell.
Oh, interesting.
Things like, I don't know, bark for quinine or leaves to make drinks and stuff. And it's a fascinating transition, because on one hand, it's offering these communities a way to participate in the economy.
Right.
But on the other hand, it leaves them super vulnerable to like global market shifts and stuff.
Right.
Like if suddenly somebody figures out how to make a synthetic version of what they're gathering,
Oh, yeah.
that's it. Their whole livelihood could just vanish.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense.
So it kind of highlights, how risky it is to rely on wild resources in today's world.
Yeah, it's a really good point. That's a really good point.
Yeah.
So then what comes after that?
So after that, you start to see the rise of pastoralism.
Pastoralism. Okay.
Which is basically, domesticating animal,
Oh, okay.
bringing them in, right? And that develops into nomadic herding,
Okay.
which is where entire communities would move around with their livestock
Oh, wow.
to get all their needs met, food, clothing, shelter,
Wow.
even tools and transportation, everything.
Wow.
And it's so cool how you see different animals being the dominant livestock in different regions, right?
Oh, like what?
So you might have, cattle being the main thing in like tropical Africa or reindeer up in the Arctic.
Right, right.
It all depends on the environment.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And a really, really important aspect of nomadic herding is something called transhumance.
Yeah, it's humans. Okay.
Which is this really cool practice of moving the herd seasonally.
Okay.
So they'll spend the summer up in the mountains, grazing in the high pastures. And then when winter comes, they'll move down to the lower plains.
Oh, interesting.
It's all about using the resources across different environments.
That makes sense.
But then on the flip side, you have commercial livestock rearing, which is like a whole different ballgame.
Okay.
This is like really organized, very capital intensive, all about producing meat, wool, hides, all for export for big markets.
Okay. And this shift away from those nomadic lifestyles,
Right.
often it's been driven by like the expansion of settled agriculture and political borders and all that.
Yeah.
It really represents like a huge turning point
Yeah.
in how humans interact with the land.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
So then comes, I guess, like the big one, right?
Yeah.
Agriculture.
Agriculture, yeah.
That's a massive field.
It is, it is.
So many different ways to do it.
Absolutely.
But like at its core, at its most basic,
yeah.
you got subsistence agriculture.
Right.
Where you're growing food mainly to eat yourself.
Exactly, yeah, to feed your family, your community.
Right, exactly.
And within that, you've got like primitive subsistence agriculture.
Okay.
Which is where you find things like shifting cultivation.
Oh, right.
The slash and burn method.
Yeah.
Which is still practiced in some tropical regions. And it's pretty simple in terms of tools.
But it involves like clearing and bringing the vegetation to create temporary farmland.
Okay.
And then they move on, let the land recover. But, a big problem with that today is that the fallow cycle, the time the land has to recover, is getting shorter and shorter because of population pressure,
Right.
More people, less land.
Right.
And so that shrinking cycle, it really undermines the whole sustainability of the system.
Yeah.
And you can end up with soil degradation, lower yields, all sorts of problems.
That makes sense.
It's a critical insight, into the challenges that these traditional farming practices are facing. And then you've got intensive subsistence agriculture.
Okay.
Which is common in those like really densely populated parts of monsoon Asia, places with, those heavy seasonal rains.
Right.
And this type of agriculture is often centered on wet paddy rice.
Oh, okay.
And it requires a ton of manual labor.
Really?
Oh, yeah. It's all done on these small farms, very labor intensive.
Interesting. Interesting.
Mm.
So then I guess we move away from subsistence, right,
Exactly.
to these like larger scale operations.
Right.
Like, what was it, plantation agriculture?
Yeah, plantation agriculture.
The stuff that the Europeans brought in, right?
Yeah, introduced by the Europeans primarily in the tropics.
Right.
And these are huge.
Okay.
They're big, they're profit-driven, focused on single crops, the cash crops.
Yeah.
Things like tea, coffee, rubber, sugarcane, all that.
Okay.
And it's all about export, sending it off to other markets. And it requires a ton of investment, a lot of infrastructure.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, very different from subsistence.
Yeah, for sure.
Then you have commercial grain cultivation,
Right.
which you typically find in those like semi-arid regions in the mid-latitudes.
Okay.
So think like the interiors of continents, and these are vast, mechanized farms,
Okay.
growing mainly wheat, corn, things like that.
So the big grain crops.
Exactly, yeah. And the yield per acre might not be super high,
Okay.
but the output per person is incredible.
Because of the machines.
Exactly, yeah.
Interesting.
And that plays a massive role in the global food supply.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then there are more integrated approaches, like mixed farming.
Oh, right.
This is more common in developed regions.
Okay.
And they combine crop cultivation, things like wheat, barley, oats, with animal husbandry.
So raising livestock, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And they often use crop rotation, to help maintain the soil health.
Right. Keep things balanced.
Yeah, and then there's dairy farming.
Right, a big one.
Huge, highly specialized, super capital intensive, all focused on milk production.
Right.
And it's almost always located near urban centers.
Yeah, that makes sense. Got to get that fresh milk.
Exactly. And what's fascinating about dairy farming is how technology, in transportation and processing has really expanded its reach, Like the availability of fresh milk and dairy products.
Yeah.
It's just incredible how far it can go now.
Yeah, that's true.
Then you have Mediterranean agriculture.
Right.
Which is really interesting because it's so specialized. They focus on these high-value crops.
Like what?
Citrus fruits, grapes for wine, olives, figs.
Okay.
And they have this like market advantage, because they can supply winter produce to other regions.
Oh, that's a good point, yeah.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
And then as you get even closer to those urban areas, you have market gardening and horticulture.
Right.
Which is like super intensive cultivation of, high value vegetables, fruits, flowers, all that. Very focused on those urban markets.
Right. Gotta get it there quick.
Exactly. And that means you need good transport, good irrigation, all the technology.
For sure.
And then there's truck farming.
Oh, yeah.
Which is like a specialized form of that.
Okay.
Really focused on vegetable production. And it's all about getting those vegetables transported overnight.
Wow, so they're fresh.
Yeah, super fresh.
Interesting.
And then, of course, you've got factory farming.
Right, the more industrial approach.
Yeah, a very modern, very industrial approach to raising livestock. And then finally, when we look at how farms are organized, you've got things like cooperative farming, where farmers pool their resources, they work together, but they still maintain their own individual farms.
Okay.
And then you've got collective farming,
right,
where the ownership of everything, like all the land and equipment, it's social, it's shared, and the labor is collective.
Right, like what they had in the Soviet Union.
Exactly, yeah, the coal cost model.
Yeah, okay, interesting.
And then shifting gears a bit, we come to mining,
right,
which is all about extracting those minerals, and that's been crucial throughout history.
Yeah, I mean, tools, right?
Tools, weapons, all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And today, those minerals are essential for industry.
Now, how profitable a mining operation is really depends on a few things.
Okay.
First, you got the physical factors.
Like what?
The size of the deposit, how high grade it is,
Right.
how much of the actual mineral is in there.
Okay.
And then you have the economic factors.
Okay, so like demand?
Demand, exactly. What technology is available, and of course, the costs.
Makes sense.
And then when you get to actually extracting the minerals, you have a couple of main methods.
All right.
Surface mining, which is used for shallower deposits.
Okay.
That's often called open cast mining.
Okay.
And it's generally more cost effective.
Right. I guess it's easier to get to.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And then you have underground mining, which is used for those deeper deposits.
Okay.
Often called shaft mining.
Mm-hmm.
And that's That's a whole other level of complexity.
Yeah, but
More expensive, more safety concerns.
right.
And one thing that's really interesting.
Is that a lot of developed economies are now outsourcing their mining operations.
Hmm?
They're having them done in developing countries.
Interesting. So it's pretty clear
Right.
the ways that we as humans
Mm-hmm.
engage in these primary activities.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's incredibly diverse, right?
Oh, absolutely.
But it's like fundamental to who we are.
It really is.
It's
Yeah.
how we survive, how we've always survived.
For sure. And it's striking
Yeah.
how these activities, they might seem basic,
Right.
but they're constantly adapting.
Mm.
In response to all these new technologies, all
Yeah.
these global economic pressures, it's really a dynamic system.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
Yeah.
And that actually brings up, I think, like a really crucial point
Yeah.
for everybody listening, like
Hmm.
something to think about.
Yeah. Yeah.
How might things that are happening right now, like,
Mhm.
climate change,
Right.
resource depletion,
Yeah.
how might those things further transform these primary activities, right?
Absolutely.
And the livelihoods of all the people that depend on them?
Yeah. It's a question worth pondering.
It is. It's a complex picture, right?
Yeah.
But hopefully, I think we did a good job
I think so too.
of like breaking down some of the basics.
Yeah, the foundational components.
Yeah, giving everybody a little perspective
I hope so.
on how this all works.
Absolutely.
So thanks for joining us
Yeah, thanks for having me.
for another deep dive.
Always a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.
All right.
Chapter 5. Secondary Activities.
All right. Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're taking a look at secondary economic activities.
Okay.
So basically, this is going to be a deep dive into how we take all that raw stuff from primary activities and make it into all the, finished products and things we see around us every day. We're going to be exploring things like manufacturing, processing, and construction. I think this is going to be really interesting because, as always, we've got a lot of great source material to go through, and this should really give us a new lens to look at, just how the economy works, Why should we care about this stuff? Well, first of all, it's kind of cool, right? You get to trace that journey of an everyday object from its very beginnings as a raw material all the way through, to the product that you pick up off the shelf. And, as you'll see, it really does reveal all these fascinating connections between different industries and the forces that shape, global trade. What's really cool is that the stuff you gave me really does go into everything. We've got basic definitions. We've got super cutting edge, like, high-tech industries.
Yeah.
So let's jump right into it. What exactly are secondary activities?
Secondary activities are those activities which add value to natural resources by transforming them.
Mm-hmm.
For example, cotton is transformed into yarn, yarn into cloth, and cloth into garments.
Okay.
Similarly, iron ore is changed into steel, and steel is used for making a variety of engineering goods.
So would it be fair to say that, manufacturing is kind of the star of the show here when we're talking about secondary activities?
Yeah, manufacturing is a very important part of secondary activities. It refers to the production of goods in large quantities after processing from raw materials to more valuable products. Manufacturing involves a wide range of activities, from handicraft to the use of advanced technology.
Gotcha. Okay, so now, one thing that I notice in the material is that we use the phrase manufacturing industry, quite a bit.
Right.
So is that meant to, I don't know, I guess clarify something? Because it's not just factories making things.
Yeah, you're right. The use of the term industry helps to clarify the activities included in this sector. So while it traditionally refers to factories, the term encompasses a wide range of activities, including the production of a film in the entertainment industry.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, when we look at modern large-scale manufacturing, specifically, the really big stuff, what are some of the things that really make it stand out?
Well, I'd say some of the key characteristics of modern large-scale manufacturing are specialization of skills leading to mass production of standardized parts,
Oh.
mechanization, meaning the use of gadgets or machines, and automation, which is using machines that can almost think for themselves.
Ah, interesting.
And of course, technological innovation. So we're constantly looking at ways to improve quality control, reduce waste, and increase efficiency, and also to control pollution.
Right, of course.
All of this means complex organizational structures with specialized labor, vast capital, and large organizations are needed.
Yeah, it sounds like, if you're going to be doing manufacturing on that kind of scale, it's not, something you just kind of slap together.
Right. It's a huge undertaking.
Now, one of the things that I thought was really interesting is that these manufacturing activities tend to, be found in certain areas. They're not evenly distributed.
Yes, they're unevenly distributed geographically, with major concentrations in less than 10% of the world's land area. And this, of course, has made them centers of economic and political power.
Yeah, and I guess that makes sense when you think about, the resources they need and just the sheer scale of the operations. It's not surprising they'd be kind of clustered together. So, what is it about a certain location that makes it really appealing, for these types of industries to set up shop there? What should we be looking for?
Well, the most crucial factor in the location of an industry is the access to the market for its products. The market consists of people who have a demand for it and also have purchasing power.
Right, because if nobody wants it, it doesn't really matter how much of it you make.
Exactly, you have to have the demand. And of course, developed regions offer large markets, which is why they attract a lot of industries. But the access to raw material is also important.
Yeah, makes sense.
It should be cheap and easy to transport. Proximity to raw materials is particularly important for industries which use heavy and bulky raw materials, or raw materials which are weight-losing or perishable in nature.
Can you give me an example of that?
Sure. The iron and steel industry, or sugar mills, or industries processing agricultural products are typically located near the sources of raw materials.
Okay.
Another crucial factor is the access to labor supply. Its importance varies with the nature of the industry. Some industries require skilled labor, while others can function with semi-skilled or unskilled labor.
Right. And I guess with automation becoming more and more prevalent, the actual number of workers needed might go down, but the need for very specific skills might go up.
Exactly. And of course, access to sources of energy is extremely important, especially for industries which use power-intensive processes like aluminum smelting. Traditionally, coal was the main source of energy, but increasingly hydroelectricity and petroleum are being used as sources of energy.
Okay, so we've talked about the market, the raw materials, labor, energy. What else should we be looking for?
Well, access to transportation and communication facilities is essential.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. You got to be able to get your stuff in and out. Yeah.
Exactly. Speedy and efficient transport is required for the assembly of raw materials and the distribution of finished goods to the market. And, of course, today, rapid and efficient communication is vital for information exchange.
Right, especially if you're working with, suppliers and customers all over the world, you got to be able to stay in touch.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about the role of government policy.
Okay, how does that come into play?
Well, governments often have regional policies to promote balanced economic development and hence set up industries in particular areas.
Ah, so they can kind of, steer things in a certain direction if they want to. Interesting. Anything else we should be thinking about?
Well, there's also the benefit of agglomeration economies.
Agglomeration economies.
Agglomeration economies. This refers to the benefits that accrue to industries from their nearness to other industries.
So, they can share resources, or maybe there's a skilled workforce in the area.
Exactly. It can lead to cost savings, increased efficiency, and even innovation. And finally, there are what are called footloose industries. These are industries that are not dependent on any specific raw material, obtain their raw materials or component parts from a variety of sources, and produce small quantities of a variety of products.
Okay, interesting.
These industries are less polluting, and because of their nature, transport costs are not a major consideration. However, access to a well-developed road network is crucial for them.
Now, I noticed that your sources break down manufacturing industries in a few different ways, different ways of classifying them. Can you give me a quick rundown of the different categories?
Sure. We can classify manufacturing industries based on a variety of factors.
Okay.
One way is based on the size of the industry.
Okay, so big versus small.
Right. We have household or cottage industries,
Okay.
which use local raw materials, simple tools, and family labor. These are usually very small scale. Then there are small-scale industries like manufacturing units, workshops, and so on, which produce goods with the help of local raw materials and power-driven machines, generally with semi-skilled labor. And, of course, there are large-scale industries which cater to a large market, use a variety of raw materials, employ a large number of workers, and use energy, specialized workers, advanced technology, and mass production techniques. They also require a large amount of capital investment.
So that would be car manufacturing, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Then we can also classify them based on the source of raw materials.
Okay.
So we have agro-based industries, for example, food processing, sugar, textiles, which use plant and animal-based products as their raw materials.
Okay.
Then there are mineral-based industries, like the iron and steel industry,
Mm.
which use minerals as their raw materials. Within this category, we have ferrous industries, using iron and steel, non-ferrous industries, using aluminum, copper, and so on, and non-metallic industries, which produce things like cement and pottery. Then there are chemical-based industries, like petrochemicals, salts, acids, fertilizers, synthetic fibers, paints, and so on.
Wow. So that's a huge range of stuff.
Yes, it is. And we also have forest-based industries like timber, plywood, furniture, paper, and so on, and animal-based industries using leather, wool, and so on.
So we can look at size, we can look at the raw materials they use. What else?
We can also look at the product or output.
Okay, yeah, what they actually make.
Right. Some industries produce basic or key industries whose products are used as raw materials for other industries.
Okay, so like, the steel that goes into building a car.
Exactly. And then there are consumer goods industries that produce goods which are directly consumed by consumers, like food, textiles, electronics, and so on.
Okay.
And finally, industries can be classified based on ownership.
Right, who's in charge?
Exactly. So there's the public sector owned by the government,
Okay.
the private sector owned by individuals or companies, and the joint sector where ownership is shared between the government and private individuals or companies.
Now, I'm really fascinated by, the super high-tech stuff, so let's talk about that. What would you say defines a high-technology industry?
A high-technology industry is the latest generation of manufacturing activities and is based on intensive research and development. These industries make use of advanced scientific and engineering knowledge.
Okay, so this is the real cutting edge.
Yes, this is where the innovation is happening. These industries employ a large proportion of professional workers, scientists, engineers, people like that.
Right, so a lot of brain power going into these.
Absolutely. And some examples of high-tech products include robotics, computer-aided design, and computer-aided manufacturing, electronic controls, new chemicals and pharmaceuticals, and so on.
Gotcha. And what about the places where these industries are located? I imagine it looks pretty different from, a traditional factory.
You're right. The landscape of high-technology industries is marked by the dispersal of office plant lab buildings in spacious, low-rise settings, often referred to as business parks. And of course, sometimes these industries are concentrated in specific regions.
Like Silicon Valley.
Exactly. These regions are called technopolies.
Technopolies.
Technopolies. They're regionally concentrated, self-sustained, highly specialized, high-tech industrial complexes.
So they kind of, create their own little ecosystem of innovation.
That's exactly right.
So when we take a step back and think about this whole journey that, everyday items make, it's clear that secondary activities are kind of the engine, right?
Yeah.
They take those raw resources and transform them into, all the stuff that has value for us.
Absolutely. Secondary activities are fundamental to transforming resources and driving economic value. And as we've seen, the location and characteristics of these industries are influenced by a complex interplay of factors, including market demand, resource availability, labor, technology, and government policies.
And of course, the sector is constantly evolving, right? With new technologies emerging all the time, we're seeing these specialized, high-tech hubs popping up all over the place. So if we think about the future, with all these changes happening in the global landscape of manufacturing, how do you think the traditional centers of economic power are going to change?
That's a great question.
What role will access to resources and maybe even more importantly, the best and brightest minds play in that, that kind of global reshuffling that's happening? It's a lot to think about, but, that's kind of what we do here on the Deep Dive, right? We give you the information, we connect the dots, and then we leave you with some big questions to ponder.
Right.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive into secondary economic activities.
You're welcome.
We'll see you next time.
Chapter 6. Tertiary and Quadinary Activities.
All right, diving in today, getting into the nitty-gritty of the service sector. It's also called tertiary activities.
Right.
We're working from this textbook chapter, really breaks it down, defines everything, shows us what these activities are, all the different types, and, why they even matter in modern economies. So the mission here, I guess you could say, is to pull out the important stuff, the core understanding of it all, without, drowning in every single detail. Tertiary activities, related activities, how it all works and why it matters.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's interesting, right? Because you think about it, so many different services, but they all make up this really crucial part of how our economies work.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. Anytime you pay for, well, anything, really, you're paying for someone's expertise or for something to be done.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, I don't know, getting your hair cut or even hiring like a high-level consultant. You're engaging with the service sector, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And that's different from, the primary sector where it's all about raw materials or secondary where you're manufacturing.
Right.
Tertiary is about, the skills, the knowledge.
Applying it.
Exactly, yeah.
So the textbook we've got breaks it all down into, well, some handy categories, right? Trade and commerce, then we got transport, communication, and then just this big umbrella of just services.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start with trade and commerce, I guess. What are we really talking about here? What's the key takeaway?
Well, I mean, at its heart, it's just buying and selling.
Right.
But the goal is profit.
Right.
Now, the book gets into the difference between, rural and urban marketing.
Okay.
Rural areas, things tend to be, well, a bit simpler, right?
Yeah.
Meeting local needs. And you often have these periodic markets.
Periodic markets, interesting.
Yeah, especially in rural areas. They, pop up at certain times. And then in urban areas, you see a much bigger variety of specialized goods.
Yeah, makes sense. More people, more demands. So within trade, we also have retail, right? Selling straight to us, the consumers.
Right.
I mean, that's your shocks, but it's also like online stores now, everything.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then there's wholesale, the business-to-business side of things.
Yeah, the suppliers.
Keeping the retailers stocked. Okay, so moving on then. Let's talk transport.
Yeah, this is all about moving stuff around. People, materials, finished goods.
That's essential.
Absolutely crucial. I mean, think about it. Getting raw materials to a factory or getting a product to someone who bought it.
Right, the whole chain.
Yeah, and we can measure it in different ways,
Yeah.
right? Kilometers, the time it takes, even the cost. And all these transport links form networks.
Networks, okay.
Connecting all the key points.
Which really highlights how important having, efficient transport is for an economy to actually work.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so next up we have communication. That's all about transmitting information, right? And it's interesting how historically that was so tied to physical transport to actually move the information. But the thing is now with all the, mobile phones and the internet.
Yeah, the modern telecommunication.
Exactly, it's
Yes.
kind of separate from the physical, right?
Yeah.
Information can travel, well, basically instantly.
Yeah. But traditional media still plays a big role, of course, getting the information out to a wider audience.
Right. Newspapers, TV, all that. Okay, and then we have just this broad services category. It feels like everything fits in there.
It does, yeah. It covers a lot. I mean, the text mentions basic stuff like your local grocery store,
Yeah.
but also super specialized services.
Yeah, like, I don't know, financial advisors, things like
Yeah,
that.
exactly.
And then you have regulated services, like utilities.
Right, water, electricity, all that.
And it's all in there. And it's interesting, the book actually mentions Mumbai's Dabbawala. Is you familiar with that?
Yeah.
Incredible example of how organized personal services can be.
Absolutely. Incredible scale.
Yeah.
So if we zoom out a bit, look at some of the bigger economic trends. You consistently see that developed economies have a larger chunk of their workforce in this service sector.
Interesting.
Shows a shift, right, towards more specialized work, more knowledge-based activities.
Yeah. Okay, so the textbook then goes into some more specific examples. Tourism is a big one.
Huge.
It's a massive global tertiary activity, creating tons of jobs, bringing in huge revenue.
Yeah.
And there are so many different factors that draw tourists in, right? Climate, historical sites, you name it. And India is doing really well with medical tourism, right?
Yeah, that's a really interesting example of a more specialized service.
Definitely. Okay, so then we get into quaternary activities, which is, well, the book calls it the knowledge sector. So that's things like gathering information, research and development, IT, all that.
Good.
And we see a lot of growth there in developed economies, and these are the kinds of jobs that often get outsourced, right?
Yeah. Often, yeah. Like, IT support, that kind of thing.
Right, exactly.
Oh.
And then building on that, we have quinary activities. So now we're talking about the highest level of decision-making.
Right.
So that's your top executives, your policymakers. They're shaping the ideas, the strategies.
Exactly. And we're even seeing things like knowledge process outsourcing.
KPO.
Yeah, where more complex information-based tasks are being contracted out.
So all of this brings us to a really important point, right? This idea of the digital divide.
Mm-hmm.
Because access to technology and the benefits that come with it, well, it's not evenly distributed. And that creates disparities both globally and within countries.
Yeah.
And that obviously has big implications for, well, for economic development and even just access to these service sector opportunities we've been talking about.
Absolutely.
So big picture, we've seen how diverse the service sector is, how important it is to modern economies, and how it's constantly evolving, moving from, basic services to these highly specialized fields, all about knowledge. It's pretty incredible.
It is. And it really makes you think about the future, right? I mean, what happens as this trend continues, as the service sector keeps growing and the digital divide, well, continues to be a challenge? What does that mean for different economies, for different societies? How do people adapt?
Yeah.
How do they thrive in this changing landscape of work and opportunity? Those are some big questions to think about.
That's something to ponder for sure.
Yeah.
Chapter 7. Transport and Communication.
All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today, we are going to look at transport and communication.
Yeah.
So, we've got some really interesting sources to dig into.
Yes, we do.
And we're going to look for those big aha moments together.
Absolutely.
About how people and goods move around and how we connect.
Yeah.
I mean, just think about it.
Yeah.
Have you ever really thought about how something like the invention of the wheel,
Wow.
like just the wheel itself, right? How that completely
Yes.
transformed human civilization and how that same kind of thing is still happening today, but with digital communication networks.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, at its heart, transport and communication are all about overcoming distance, right?
Right.
Whether you're talking about moving actual physical things or just sharing information, it's this ability to connect up production and consumption and people with each other that makes specialization possible. And it just drives
Yeah.
improvements in the way we live. And, initially they were very much intertwined, like messengers going out with news.
Yeah.
But they've evolved into these really amazingly complex systems now.
Well, let's talk about how we move stuff first.
Okay.
So, land transport. Imagine someone getting carried around in a palanquin
Wow, yeah.
or using tack animals like mules, which,
Mules are still vital.
they still are in so many rural areas.
So many places, yeah.
Then the wheel comes along.
Huge invention.
Right, total game changer.
Oh, yeah.
But then, the steam engine
That's when things
it really kicks things up a notch.
took off, yeah.
Like the Stockton and Darlington Railway back in 1825.
1825.
It wasn't just about moving coal around.
Yeah.
It was about opening up these inland resources,
Yeah.
changing the landscape, changing economies.
Exactly. And then you've got the internal combustion engine,
Yeah,
which gave us the road networks that we have today.
right. And interesting how roads provide that.
It's the last mile.
That last mile, that door-to-door service.
Absolutely, yeah.
Though, of course, the quality and congestion can be very different
Oh, yeah.
depending on where you are.
Huge variation.
Right. But for moving large amounts of stuff over long distances.
Then you're talking railways.
Railways, right.
Yes.
You mentioned varying track gauges.
Oh, yeah.
That's a good reminder that these systems often have these little quirks from the past
Yeah.
that still affect how efficient they are today.
Still with us, yeah.
And those transcontinental railways,
Wow.
like in one of the sources, the Trans-Siberian,
Yeah.
linking these massive distances,
Huge distances, yeah.
or the Trans-Canadian,
Uh-huh.
which was just so important for connecting different parts of the country economically.
Yeah. Nation-building projects, really,
Absolutely.
as much as just economic arteries. And then there's pipelines, too.
Yeah, pipelines.
Quietly moving all that stuff around.
Yeah, massive quantities of liquids and gases.
Like the Big Inch in the U.S. Yeah, the Big Inch. Or even milk in New Zealand.
Milk, wow.
Yeah.
Often unseen, but completely essential.
So totally essential.
Okay, let's talk about water.
Okay.
The sheer efficiency of moving huge amounts of stuff across the ocean.
Amazing, yeah.
And you don't even have to build roads.
That's right. No construction needed.
That North Atlantic sea route,
Oh, yeah.
that's a major artery for global trade.
Absolutely.
And then think about the Suez Canal.
Yeah.
The impact it had on the Mediterranean-Indian Ocean route.
Oh, yeah.
It just transformed things.
Completely changed things.
Cutting travel time so much compared to going around the Cape of Good Hope
Right.
and that single level canal.
Yeah.
It handles something like 100 ships every day.
It's an amazing feat of engineering.
It really is.
Yeah.
And then there's the Panama Canal.
Oh, yeah, the Panama Canal.
Completely different kind of challenge.
Totally different.
With its locks connecting these two huge oceans.
It's incredible.
And a big impact on trade flows, especially for Latin America.
Yeah, particularly for Latin America.
It just shows how humans can reshape global geography and economics.
That's it, yeah. Human ingenuity at its finest.
And what about inland waterways?
Oh, yeah. Whoa.
Like the Rhine in Europe?
The Rhine is a great example.
Historically so important for connecting industrial areas.
Yeah, it's been vital.
Although their role has changed a bit with all these other transport options.
It's shifted a bit, yeah.
Right. And then there's air transport.
Air transport, yes.
The ultimate in speed, even if it is more expensive.
It's the fastest, but it comes at a cost, yeah.
But it's shrunk the world in terms of travel time.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it gives us access to these really remote places.
Yeah, places you couldn't reach otherwise.
But the infrastructure you need is just huge.
Oh, it's enormous.
Which is why it's most developed in industrialized countries.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Leading to that dense network we see in the Northern Hemisphere.
It's interesting, isn't it? How all these advancements in transport,
Yeah.
they allow faster movement of people and goods.
Right.
And that leads to more complex and interconnected societies.
Right. And then you've got the revolution in how we share information.
Oh, yeah, the communication revolution.
Like the telegraph.
Yeah, the telegraph was huge.
Crucial for connecting the American West.
Absolutely. And then the telephone.
The telephone, right.
It played such a big role in urbanization.
Yeah. And now we've got cell phones.
Cell phones everywhere.
Using satellites to bridge those connectivity gaps in rural areas.
Yeah, connecting everyone.
And then the jump to optic fiber and the internet.
Oh, that's been a seismic shift.
Because
The speed and the sheer volume of information transfer.
unprecedented.
Totally unprecedented.
It's like distance doesn't even matter anymore.
It's amazing.
And satellite communication
Yeah.
emerging in the 70s.
The 70s.
It made distance almost irrelevant in terms of cost and speed.
Yeah, it really did.
Like India's early satellite programs.
Yeah, great examples of that impact.
So this deep dive into your sources,
It's fascinating.
it really shows how this dynamic between moving things and moving information,
Yeah.
it's constantly evolving.
Always changing.
From those very first trails to the digital networks we use today.
Yeah, it makes you wonder.
It does.
With the pace of innovation accelerating like this,
Yeah.
what kind of unexpected connections and changes might we see in the future?
It's exciting to think about.
It is.
How these changes will redefine our understanding of distance and connection.
Who knows what's next?
Really makes you think.
It does.
Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
My pleasure. We'll see you next time.
See you then.
Chapter 8. International Trade.
All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going really global. We're talking international trade. You know, it's like, when you think about it, like all the stuff we have, so much of it comes from all over the world.
It really does.
And it's a huge system. How does it all work?
Right.
So that's what we're going to break down today.
Yeah, we're going to go back to like, how did people even start trading with each other across huge distances and then all the way to the modern system we have now?
Exactly. So starting really basic, the earliest form of trade, like I want to say caveman days, was basically barter, right?
Yeah, straight up.
Like, I've got extra berries, you've got extra flint.
Let's make a deal.
Let's make a deal.
Mhm.
But what's so interesting is that, barter still exists.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Like in some places in the world.
Yeah.
There's this place in India, the John Beal Mela, where people come from all over.
Yeah.
And they're literally like, I've got pottery, you've got blankets, let's trade.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
But you can see the inherent problem with bartering, right?
All right.
Like, what if I need plumbing done, but the plumber doesn't need any pottery?
Right. That's the double coincidence of wants problem is
Yeah.
like both people have to need what the other person has, and that's, not always easy to find.
Not easy at all. So obviously, money makes everything much easier.
Oh, absolutely. And it's interesting to think, like, before we had coins, before we had paper money, people used all sorts of things as currency.
It's true.
Flintstones, cowrie shells, even animal parts,
It's so weird to think about. I was reading that even the word salary comes from the Latin salarium, which meant payment in salt.
Oh, wow. I did not know that.
Isn't that interesting? Like a salt, something that we just have in our kitchen, like so basic at some point, was so valuable that you could literally get paid in it.
Wow. Yeah, that really puts things in perspective about, how money evolved over time.
Absolutely. So money solved a lot of problems. So let's talk about early international trade. I imagine back then It was pretty risky, right? Sending stuff across huge distances.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, pirates and bandits and storms and all sorts of things.
Right. So what kinds of things were they trading, like, back then?
Well, it was mostly luxury goods, things that were small and valuable and could be easily transported.
I see, like spices and silks.
Exactly, yeah. Jewelry, fine clothes, things like that. They catered to the wealthy, the elite.
And was the Silk Road, was that one of the earliest examples of large-scale international trade?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. This massive, 6,000-kilometer trade route connecting Rome all the way to China. It's incredible.
Wow.
Silk going west, wool and precious metals going east. It really shows how, even back then, people were connected by this desire for goods from faraway places.
It's crazy how far back it goes. I mean, obviously some less savory parts of early trade history, too, if we have to talk about the slave trade.
Yeah, absolutely. A very dark chapter.
During the colonial period, you had the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Spanish, the British, all involved in this horrific practice of transporting Africans to the Americas to work on plantations. And it was a huge business for over 2 centuries.
It's just staggering to think about the scale of human suffering that was involved.
Totally. And we actually have sources from that time, like there's this 1829 advertisement for a slave auction.
Yeah, I've seen those. Those are really chilling.
And it just, it makes you think about the human cost of all of this, right?
Right, and how sometimes, profit and greed just totally override ethical considerations.
Absolutely. So, fast forward a bit, you had the Industrial Revolution, huge changes, right?
Oh, yeah, completely changed the game.
So you have this huge demand for raw materials,
Mm-hmm.
grains, meat, wool, to feed those factories, to clothe those growing cities.
But at the same time, you see the value of those raw materials decrease relative to manufactured goods.
Right, so you have these industrialized nations, they're importing raw materials, they're exporting finished goods, and that sets up a whole new pattern of trade that continues to this day, right?
Absolutely. And by the late 19th century, those industrialized nations, they became each other's main trading partners.
So the whole world was really changing. And then you have the world wars, which obviously disrupt everything.
Yeah, all sorts of trade restrictions, tariffs, countries trying to protect their own industries.
But, in the aftermath of the wars, you have this push for more cooperation.
Right, the idea that trade can actually promote peace and understanding.
And that's where we see the emergence of organizations like GATT, which eventually became the WTO, the World Trade Organization.
Yeah, aiming to reduce tariffs, promote free trade, and create a more stable global trading system.
So that brings us to today. Why do countries trade with each other?
Well, I think one of the key reasons is specialization.
Right, like focusing on what you're good at.
Exactly, yeah. The idea of comparative advantage. Like, some countries are naturally better suited to producing certain goods.
Right, like you said, you're probably not going to be growing coffee beans in Iceland.
Probably not. So, you have differences in natural resources, climate, even things like, cultural practices and population size. All these things play a role.
So it's a whole combination of factors.
Yeah. And then you add in things like a country's level of economic development, how much foreign investment they have, and of course, modern transportation has made it possible to move goods all over the world.
And the cost of transport has gone way down, too.
Exactly.
So, we're all kind of interconnected in this huge global web.
It's really incredible when you think about it.
So when we're talking about international trade, we also have to talk about the balance of trade, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's basically the difference between how much a country imports versus how much it exports.
And if a country imports way more than it exports, that's not a good situation.
Right. Yeah, that means they have a negative balance of trade, which can put a strain on their financial resources.
So countries are always trying to, walk this tightrope.
Right, yeah.
And then you have different types of trade. There's, bilateral trade, which is just between two countries. They make a specific agreement.
Right, like a one-on-one deal.
And then there's multilateral trade, which involves many countries.
Yeah, a lot more complex, but it can also create more opportunities.
So it's like a big trading party.
Exactly, yeah.
With lots of different rules and regulations.
And sometimes, there's this concept of most favored nation status, where one country might give another country special treatment in trade deals.
So that can get kind of complicated.
Oh, yeah, it can get very political.
And then we have the idea of free trade, which sounds great in theory, right?
Well, the idea is to reduce trade barriers, tariffs, quotas, things like that. And the argument is that it leads to more competition, lower prices, and ultimately benefits everyone.
Right, and more choices for consumers, right?
Exactly. But There are also concerns, especially from developing countries, that free trade can actually harm their economies.
Right, like if they can't compete with the big guys.
Exactly. And there's also the issue of dumping, where one country might flood another country's market with goods that are sold at super low prices, which can put local businesses out of business.
Yeah, like I was reading that the U.S. has actually imposed anti-dumping duties on shrimp imports from India and Thailand because they were, like, selling it too cheap.
Right. So it's a complicated issue with lots of different perspectives.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then there's the WTO, the World Trade Organization. What's their role in all of this?
Well, they kind of act as the referee, setting the rules for global trade, trying to resolve disputes between countries. They evolved from GATT, which was created after World War II.
But they're not without their critics, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Some people argue that they favor rich countries over poor countries, that they don't do enough to protect things like the environment and workers' rights.
It's a lot to balance.
Absolutely. And then, on top of all of that, you have the rise of regional trade blocs like the European Union or NAFTA.
Right, where countries in a particular region decide to team up and make it easier to trade with each other.
Yeah, it's like creating a smaller, more manageable trading zone within the larger global system.
So as you can see, international trade is incredibly complex, with a long history, a lot of moving parts, and definitely some controversy.
Definitely.
So, after this whirlwind tour of international trade, what stands out to you? What's the most surprising thing you've learned?
For me, it's just the sheer scale of it all. Like, we really are living in a global village. The clothes we wear, the food we eat, the phones we use, all these things come from all over the world. And it's just incredible how interconnected we all are.
I totally agree. And
Right.
for our listeners out there, next time you're shopping for groceries or clothes or electronics, just take a moment to think about where all this stuff came from, how it got here, and all the people and systems that make international trade possible.
Really mind-boggling.
It really is. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.